Okay, if we could have everybody's attention. Thank you very much for coming to this, our first Open Research lecture. This will be an annual event. And I am really pleased to have so many people in person. It's very exciting to have both an in-person and well, a hybrid event with people at home as well. Before I go through some of the housekeeping slides and introduce our first speaker, or our inaugural lecture speaker, I'd like to introduce David Sampson. David, unfortunately, has got COVID and so is joining us from home. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much. That's really wonderful to be with you all, at least virtually. I'm actually very disappointed not to be able to join you in person, but welcome to our guests and panelists to the University of Surrey. I hope you can tell that even though I have COVID, I'm actually traveling pretty well, so I'm not doing too badly at all. Our Open Research web pages announce Open Research, used interchangeably with open science, is a set of values and practices that seek to make research easily discoverable, transparent, publicly available, and reusable. And we go on to say, the aim of our Open Research initiative is to foster a collaborative and inclusive research culture, to spur innovation and creativity, and where applicable, to support the reproducibility of research findings. So, what are these values and practices exactly? Well, the values are those required to meet our commitments to conduct research with integrity. In fact, to meet our commitments to the Research Integrity Concordat. And these values are fully consistent with the new values espoused in our strategy refresh: inclusion, inspiration, innovation, integrity. And these are the same ones that are being championed in our Values Awards. And I hope there's at least a few Values Awards recipients in the audience. And as to practices, these are evolving, and we will all no doubt today have the opportunity to update ourselves on best and innovative practices. So on making research easily discoverable, the open access movement, that is making your research outputs freely accessible to the widest possible audience, is playing a large role. UKRI is playing a strong leadership role nationally in open access, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that, and I'm excited to hear more about that this afternoon. And the UK internationally is leading in driving open access practices. So journal outputs will soon be well regulated, and even monographs are coming under the open access regimen in a few years. Other outputs, such as data sets, methods, and underlying materials, are quickly being included, and their more mainstream inclusion will change our research practices for the better. These changes will require a change in research culture from us all. And on transparent, publicly available, and reusable, in effect, we mean returning to the origins of research. The scientific method has always expected sufficient openness on how the research was done to enable its reproduction by an interested expert, so that we may all participate in its advance, something hugely brought to the fore by COVID and vaccine research during the pandemic, but so important more generally. And available to the public, a public, after all, who have put their trust in us to spend their money wisely and expecting us to do things for the greater good, which is indeed core to our stated mission as a university. So, what is not to like about open research? And when we say open research at Surrey, we mean open research and innovation. You might say, so what about protecting my intellectual property? How can that be open? Well, at Surrey we say, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. Whilst patent protection requires secrecy for a period, it is, in fact, a process of controlled public disclosure, conveying rights to the patent holder in return for that disclosure, such that those skilled in the art, in inverted commas, may indeed reproduce the invention. So in many ways, our global intellectual property protection framework supports discoverability, transparency, and reusability. It only remains a question of embargoes. And such patented research can still be published in the scholarly literature. And we regularly do this at Surrey as part of the vast majority of our contractual agreements with business, and we should continue to do so. So our commitment to open research has been strong over the years, but with the creation of the specific position of academic lead, research culture and integrity in late 2019, held by today's host, Professor Emily Farron, and the crystallising of the Open Research Working Group and its inclusion into our formal committee structures via the Research Integrity and Governance Committee, we have certainly given that commitment a strong boost in recent times. And externally, joining the UK Reproducibility Network as a founder member has also marked out our intent to play a leading role nationally in open research. And we are not alone, as we will certainly hear from our colleagues today. We are being joined by some of the most prominent bodies internationally. In December just gone, UNESCO published its recommendations on open science, a world first, under the banner of making science more accessible, inclusive, and equitable for the benefit of all. When the UN gets involved, we know a movement is gathering momentum. Think Sustainable Development Goals, for example, that are now so central to all that we do in universities. At Surrey, we welcome open research and open science initiatives. We are already embracing them and we are ready to do more. I look forward to a stimulating afternoon of learning more from colleagues on all aspects of open research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Okay, so you can watch me doing everything. Okay, so just to share our slides. So I have a little bit of housekeeping to do, but also just to give a little bit more information. It's not moving along. Here we go. To give a little bit more information about some of the initiatives that David was talking about. So as David said, we joined the UKRN as one of the first universities to join at an institutional level in the end of 2019. And these are all initiatives listed here that have been happening since we joined the UKRN and since my post was created. You can find links to all of these in the Open Research Handbook. And the Open Research Handbook is linked through from your programme book, which you received by email yesterday. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to say, for those of you that are members of the University of Surrey, if you haven't joined our Open Research community on Teams, please do. Again, the information on how to do that is in the Open Research Handbook. I'm also going to talk you through our Open Research module. Let me just minimise the people. Hide video panel. Okay. So our Open Research module, congratulations to those that have already completed the module. This is at the moment only available to the University of Surrey, but we hope to make it open access to all. It's self-paced, you can do it in under an hour. If you haven't quite found the time to do it and you think it would be really useful for you to do it alongside your peers and with an expert, you can see listed here a number of dates where Christine D'Autis, who is the head of our open research team who created the module, will be on hand to help you go through the module. So this is our lineup for today. I've just put this up. You already know what's going to be happening today, but it's a good prompt for me to remember to thank all of our speakers, all of our guests that have come today. So to thank Karen Salt for coming today to give our inaugural lecture, and to thank Grace Gottlieb, Martin Ribery and Marcus Manafo, who have come here for the panel session. If you haven't got your open research programme, there's a QR code there if you didn't get the email with it, so you can get it via the QR code. Just a little bit of housekeeping. At the event last year, which was a smaller online event, we asked for feedback, and some of the feedback was that you wanted more networking opportunities. Hence why we have the discussion, so that we can discuss things. We've got the wine reception. We may have gone a bit too far with the badges, but you may have noticed that you have colours on your badges. This is because when you registered, we asked you what you were interested in, so what you'd like to find out more about and what you have experience of. So if there are particular topics that you want to discuss, go and find people with the right coloured stickers, and you should be able to get that discussion going. If you want more stickers, they're all on the registration desk. Fill your boots. Okay, on to the prize. So you are all going to be helping me find out what the most inspiring poster is. It's up to you to vote. So the most inspiring poster, just reading the text, it's the poster that most inspired you, either to change your practice to be more open or to find out more about which open research practices are relevant to you. I seem to have it on an automated. So the poster numbers are in the programme book. They're also in the corner of each of the poster stands. The ballots are on the registration desk. So please write clearly what number poster you would like to vote for and put it in the little red post box. And at the end of today at 5:15, I will be announcing who the winner of the Open Research Prize is. We would just like to get to know you a little bit. So we all know that you're here because you're interested in open research. If you could go to this QR code, let me just move this out of the way. Or if you go to menti.com and put in this number 8864745, then we would really like to know what motivates you to engage in open research. And I will show the results live. Okay, so we've got some things coming in here. Collaboration, conducting higher quality, helping, transparency. And I will share this word cloud with everybody who's registered at the end. I'll just give it a few minutes for people to get a chance to go on. Could somebody put... So if you go to www.menti.com and the number is 8864745. This is great, lots of things coming through now. Collaboration and transparency right in the middle there. So if you don't know about these word clouds, the bigger the writing, the more people have inputted that word. I'll give it 10 more seconds. But feel free to keep inputting because I'll download it at the end so that we can circulate it. Okay. I'll leave it there actually. That was my last slide on the main PowerPoint slide. So I'll just leave that there. And then Karen, if you want to come down, then we can start your lecture. So we will be having questions at the end of Karen's lecture. Just for the people at home, so the people in the room, for the people at home, please don't ask a question until we've given you a microphone so that everybody can hear. So I will just stop sharing this and share Karen's slides.
Okay.
Oh, I will just go in and. Yeah, I have got a clicker, but it doesn't seem to be quite working.
Not mine doing it by hand.
I'll just make it into. There it is. Okay, and I will just hide this so that for the duration of your talk, it's not. Okay, so this should work, but it's not. So there should be an, yeah, so that, Eric,
Okay.
you'll have to work with that.
No, I can do that.
So to introduce Karen Salt. So Dr. Karen Salt is an expert on transformative change with a wealth of experience. She's been working with different organizations, different charities and government bodies. So Karen is currently Deputy Director of R&D Culture and Environment. Karen's going to talk to us today on the topic of open and transparent research culture. So over to you, Karen.
Excellent. There's so many things up here. I don't know quite where to put my body so that you can see me. I think I might stay here if that's okay. The crew will let me know if I should move. I am delighted, absolutely delighted to both receive the invitation and to be able to accept it to be the inaugural lecture for this series. It's, I get to see people. It's still a bit exciting to me to be able to give a talk to a live audience. Although thankful that we've got people who are also hybrid working, hybrid meeting, and are at home. But I'm a walker. I tend to move across the stage, sometimes sitting on a chair. But the performance part of speaking really galvanizes me, and it just gives me a really great sense of energy. You cannot do that in a screen by yourself where you can't see anyone. So I've given a lot of talks to webinars of thousands of people. I think they're there. I don't know. I can't see anything. I don't even see a number at the bottom. It's just me looking at me and then more or less making myself amuse and laugh. So I look forward to you laughing at the appropriate times when I say something funny. I really will appreciate the chance to be able to look at you, to judge where we might want to go next with the conversation, and also to just feel like we're communicating. And again, this is not in any way to disparage the folks who are online. This is a tough space we're in now, trying to make hybrid working or hybrid engaging or engagement be as inclusive as it possibly can, but also at the same time has all the richness in every dynamic that we would like to have. So thank you, and I look forward to talking through a number of things today. So my sincere thanks to Emily for the gracious introduction, as well as to David for laying out some things that I didn't have to say, which is also really good. So thank you for that as well. But I'm going to give you a tiny bit more about myself, actually, before I turn into talking about what I've been imagining with this talk moving forward. Emily is absolutely right with capturing my job. I am Deputy Director of R&D Culture and Environment. I'm sure you have no idea what any of that means. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first real critical one is the policy area that I cover within UKRI for all 9 of the constituent bodies within UKRI, plus the 5,000 members of staff that are working in various facilities doing direct research. And that includes the folks who are off on ships or in the Antarctic, all the way through to then engaging directly into working with our various stakeholders and partners that we engage with, like the University of Surrey and others. So it's a big group. The scale is actually quite massive when you put that into that perspective. UKRI has about 8,000 members of staff. So this is directly creating policies directly for those folks engaged in doing this work. And they're directly engaged in doing research, whether or not that's at Harwell or Hartree or various locations, and in often very complicated sets of scenarios, all the way through to thinking about the CDTs and DTPs, or which are collaborative doctoral training centers, or things like the catapults, which is an investment that Innovate UK has around innovation. And those are stretched all across the UK, delivering an incredible amount of innovation and exchange. So if you're really starting to think about what R&D culture and environment looks like, I mean, I'm just giving you a little bit of the potted history. That is the area that policy area covers. But there's another reason you don't know too much about this policy area. It's actually because UKRI made the bold decision to actually amalgamate and bring together a number of different areas and topics that are typically siloed and disaggregated in many institutions. So in my portfolio is research integrity. Many of you might know of an integrity officer, potentially perhaps in the libraries or affiliated with a journal. You might have some that are affiliated with your departments or your locations, but those folks are quite different than the folks who may be tackling bullying harassment, which is also in my policy area. Equality, diversity, inclusion, which is often kind of tucked up underneath both HR as aspects of controls, and maybe some aspects of EDI in relationship to performance within departments, thinking like hiring, promotion, these sorts of issues, attainment, awarding gaps, et cetera. But research culture, and research and innovation culture is also in the policy area. Really firmly understood that that is a location for it. Open access or open research is also part of that same policy area. I have teams working across all of these spaces. And an area that actually many might imagine might not be a part of it, but actually for me, both in terms of my own professional background, but ultimately what we're seeing as some of the fundamentals is research and innovation security. So all of the threats and risks of ultimately engaging in international collaboration and partnerships. So again, it's a very interesting portfolio to work in. And if you've spent any time talking to folks in the university around mitigating and managing risks and threats, almost immediately the conversation goes to open research. It's almost a guarantee. There'll be questions about the partnering, there'll be questions about agreements, but open data and open research will usually be a fundamental component of that set of conversation. If you look across the entire R&D sector, almost in a most consistent cases, these sets of challenges and problematics, because these are massive, right? They are often attended to and worked on in isolation of each other, as if they are working with completely different sets of circumstances and systems, or completely different sets of controls. And often they're not. They are amalgamating and pulling across that system to ultimately move forward. So I'm going to spend some time talking through the conundrum that I'm seeing when we start to think about what does that future look like. It's not just stating our values or really articulating where we want to go or really boldly trying to imagine where open research will go next and what that could look like, but really starting to get underneath the fundamentals of this in terms of what does that look like within our system? How do we do this in a way that does not create moreness? Right? That's not necessarily more bureaucracy, just more papers, more data, more information, more stuff, more reporting, more. And that moreness goes somewhere that we don't quite know where that moreness goes. And you don't really have any type of ability to analyze any of that to really get a sense of efficacy, to really get a sense of where we might go next or where the gaps are in the investment. So I'm going to spend some time talking a bit about that, but I'm going to take you into that journey ultimately by spending a little bit of time talking about my own professional journey into some of this. And I'm happy to answer any of these questions in regards to the policy area. Although I mean, you could look all of this up. You've probably seen and talked about the open access policy coming live on Friday. Some of you are pretty well steeped into that. So we don't necessarily need to rehash all of that, but I am here and I will do my best. But what Emily didn't mention is my own actual background from a research perspective. So I am a policymaker. This is what I do now. I policy make, strategize, think about implementation, think about scale, think about engaging and interacting across the dynamism of our R&D sector within the UK. But I spent a lot of time working internationally, working with other bodies, working with other funders, really starting to get underneath all of those policy areas that I described and talked about. And I'm really quite blessed to be in a really exciting role, working very closely with the CEO of UKRI, as well as with all the executive chairs and with various leaders across the system. But I haven't always been a policymaker. There are some who are just like, well, I'm sure that's all you've ever done. And it's like, well, no. I essentially came into the organization a number of years ago after directing a research center and having large numbers of grants. I think right before I came in, I was probably holding a portfolio of about 6 active grants, both PIing and co-ing, large teams, working with community-based researchers, all sorts of independent researchers, various different institutions of all different types, and ultimately leading and thinking collectively with wide sets of people around a whole range of issues. I mean, fundamental for me was, how do we start asking questions differently? That's how I started. How do we ask different sets of questions doing research? What are the types of methodologies that we need that really can give us the creativity and the energy to tackle massive grand problems? It's not necessarily how do we assemble teams and pull people together and recognize the value. That's great. I was really wanting to start with those fundamental questions, because in lots of cases, we've been knocking against the door around a whole set of issues and not necessarily making the sets of grand transformations that we might like to have. So maybe we might start with asking different sets of questions. Maybe we might need to have different sets of people around the table. Maybe we might need to organize and manage those projects completely differently. Why do we need a PI? Why can't you have multiple sets of people who are collaborative leaders leading on projects, ultimately starting to understand the fundamentals? And why do they need to be based at a university? Why couldn't you have those collaborative leaders based at a community organization, based in parts of various other public sectors, and actually be able to collectively come together and do the work differently? Not just have different sets of results, think differently about metrics, think differently about outputs, but think differently about the fundamentals. These were the types of things that galvanized me as a researcher. And I was really interested in trying to create these projects that would radically transform, not just necessarily, again, what we might do with the work at the end, but how we would do that work from the very beginning. And ultimately starting to really recognize that this work, if we really start to think of it from a research perspective, would ultimately transform both who we would value, the type of skills and knowledge that those folks might have, but ultimately, fundamentally, what would research and innovation work look like? And the type of system that we might set up that would support that. So in doing that work, almost as a direct result, questions around open data were like fundamental to me. How do you create sets of information and material that you don't sort of try to keep so close to you, either because you're so fearful of other people understanding it and interacting with it, or fearful of it maybe being stolen or turned into a product, or various other things, the stuff that David was talking about, but ultimately that it is such a mark of the sacrifice you've made as an academic or a researcher, right? Like that just seemed fundamentally odd to the way of my thinking, when it was about the transformative power of knowledge and information. My goodness, when you come at it from that perspective, the transformative power, the idea of open data just seems logical. It's not a radical idea at all to allow others the access and the ability to not only get that information, but to be the contributor to it, to be the creator of it themselves, not just to be able to reuse it or to pick it up from somebody else, but ultimately to be able to be a creator as part of that process. And again, I was fascinated by open data questions and open information, but really at that fundamental core was ideas and knowledge, right? Taking those ideas and knowledge fundamentals and then starting to think quite a lot about the data. Interoperability was then almost immediately an issue, and access, and what happens behind firewalls, and what happens behind all sorts of rituals and cultural traditions around how you produce information, how you produce knowledge, how you package it up. So there's one thing about having an open data system. There's something completely different by still using the mechanics and the lexicon that ultimately means that other people can't access and understand what they're reading and looking at anyway, because it's all still steeped in the sort of cultural drama of that sort of sets of exchanges. Now, there's a whole set of people who've been doing this work for a really long time, who've been really interested about How do we do participatory work differently? How do we collaborate differently? How do we understand who is fundamentally a part of a team and what that team might look like? And ultimately how we might understand the fundamentals of knowledge and information. There are some who are calling some parts of this the decolonization movement. There are some who are really interested in participatory aspects and co-production and co-design. We're not in new territory, but I think we're in this really interesting moment right now about the fundamental aspects of the types of transformation that we're trying to create. And we're really now starting to unpick, I think, the structures that we're going to need to ultimately allow this to happen. And again, doing it in a way where we're not so siloed across these different dynamics, dynamic spaces, especially in environments where we are dealing with resource scarcity, or time scarcity, where you just don't have more time to fill out more things, to do more stuff somehow better, right? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So how do we just get cleverer about how we're doing this, and where that next step might be, and where the revolution might actually happen? Where does that radical transformation? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about exactly what that says. A call for a kind of radical, inclusive, and open future. What is that next step? How do we really start to think about transforming and making some changes that isn't that piecemeal? I mean, it'll be seismic, but it's piecemeal seismic when we start to think at the systems level across all of research and innovation, as opposed to the discrete areas. And that may mean that it's not all up to you. That might mean that it's you, your neighbor's neighbor, your neighbor's friend, their cat, the dog, you know, we need to bring all of these parts together in a way that ultimately allows us to move forward. So I don't have a lot of slides, but I have a few things that I want to take you through as steps of some of this, just to sort of lay out my case, see where we might go, and actually pose some questions back to you that I hope will stimulate where we might go next in the conversation. So let me push the little button. Right. So I did say I wasn't going to spend a lot of time covering what David already laid out. But as you can see, there's lots of stuff happening in the open research land. There are an incredible amount of initiatives and activities. I mean, in David's talk, I think in Emily's, and you just saw the slide Emily put up, and this is no condemnation onto the amount of work, but that is just one of many different institutions or areas that we could point to where people have web pages, information, stuff, and things, and initiatives, and activities, and Concordates, and various other stuff. We're really busy. We're really busy grappling with this. We're really busy thinking about it. I think we're fundamentally really trying to think about those sorts of ways we might link across and to whether or not you're working in libraries or data management, all the way through to thinking about this from, you know, this is your first massive research project that you're engaged in as a postgraduate researcher, and you're trying to understand the fundamentals of how you build projects like these, and understand that. And I recognize that those folks online, those folks in the room, you are all crossing this whole dynamic in terms of just trying to figure this out in terms of your own practice, on a practice basis. And then some of you are building these systems. You are ultimately trying to grapple with how to do this on a very consistent basis. So there is a consistent structure and protocols and processes underneath all of this that, that allows anyone from any discipline to engage and interact in this space. And again, that's both exciting, really exciting to see, but ridiculously overwhelming. Imagine you're just starting to dip your toe into open research and you just Google open research policies or practices. It's a landslide of stuff. One of the challenges, there's lots of folks trying to cohere this and bring it together in a way that it doesn't feel so overwhelming, but there's a lot of material to start to try to synthesize and try to understand, both in a position from an individual or collective level, but also at that strategic organizational level in terms of where do you start and how do you break things down. We are definitely breaking down boundaries. You know, we're well beyond GitHub now. In terms of thinking about codes, we're well beyond thinking about citizen science in terms of the types of ways that people might engage and do participatory work. We've moved in huge strides around a number of disciplines. Some of you might use things like the UK Data Archive if you're doing social science research, or a whole set of other areas where if you know, from physics research all the way through to other sets of things that we have a lot of things, and we've been breaking down these sets of boundaries and these sets of understandings from a data perspective, quite specifically, but also from an access perspective in terms of people's engagement and interaction. And I think there's been work to try to find common ground around some of this, to really start to understand the fundamental aspects in these various different locations and spaces. They're still a bit siloed sometimes in terms of what their structure and approach might be. And again, that open data, open access to open research conundrum, you can really quite see it, where folks are really thinking and investing quite heavily in terms of how do people gain access to sets of information, and how are they able to use it? And then folks who are really thinking about open research, or let's say open research practices like peer review, open peer review. So some are really investing a lot of energy in making process be open, and thinking that that is going to be fundamentally important about research culture, as opposed to outputs being open. And then others are really thinking about how to transform who does the work. How do you break down the silos between the roles that people might have and the types of values and contributions of those roles, so that you essentially have a contributing author who could be a community member, as opposed to the corresponding author essentially being a member of staff at a university. So we're coming at it from lots of different ways to break down these various different sets of things. And for many, they're driven by some fundamental questions. One big question is these questions of inclusion, and saw that come up in the Wordle as folks really started to think about open research being fundamentally about how to create an inclusive culture. Now, that might be a result or an outcome, but there are definitely some things underneath all of that that start with what are all of these component parts, right? How do we actually bring and draw these component parts together? So that means we're actually talking about the life cycle of research and innovation, like the whole life cycle, from the earliest kernel of an idea all the way through to that end result of material. Let's say stuff. Doesn't have to be in a journal article or book, it could be stuff of any kind. It could even be strategies as stuff. And I'm a real big component of the fact that we don't actually document enough of the strategic thinking that underpins research and innovation, and we don't recognize that as stuff. And the reason why I'm really focusing on this is that any of you who do organizational change will know that stuff from a strategic perspective is crucial. But we're not collecting it. We're not really understanding it from an organizational perspective. And we don't actually value that as it outputs and contributions, so that kind of strategic thinking. So I think we've got quite a lot to do around the life cycle of all of this to really start to understand, because for me, professional services should be a part of this conversation, and it's not typically. If you go to many institutions, professional services live someplace else, right? Remember the silos I was describing? They live in silo land, doing things. But yet, if you have a life cycle, this is a fundamental support and function unit, and in some places work dynamically right alongside of researchers and innovators who should be understood just as much from an open data, open research perspective as a contributor, but the silo has made that be a function that lives separately. So again, we have more work we can do, I think, to really start to think from a systems perspective, what do we mean and understand around open research and open access that isn't necessarily positioning certain sets of people into this space to be included in, but actually could go much, much bigger. And I will often sit upon this, especially in regards to COVID, that many of us would not be able to exist without these folks doing things both and in this moment to make sure that we're able to have that dynamism and this hybrid spaces, or more importantly, your cleaners in your buildings, your health and safety officers, and librarians, archivists, right? We got a whole set of people that if we're really starting to fundamentally rethink what does open access and open data mean? What does that life cycle mean? Who are the contributors? We've done a pretty crap job of recognizing the contributions of a wealth of people who allow us to be able to function, from plant operators to greenhouse growers, right? So if we're really, really understanding the radicalism of what this transformation needs to look like, the fact that you include a student on a project, whoopee, that's good. Students are brilliant. But that's not necessarily some of the fundamental aspects of really starting to think really differently about how do we do our work? How does that system actually function? And how do we give value and contribution to those various folks that are involved? Now, this is complicated. This is not easy stuff to start to think about how you start to understand that. Is it the people who flip the lights on? Is it where do you stop and where do you stop? I totally understand that, but I'm not too sure we're asking the right questions right now. We're doing quite a lot of piecemeal, very, very, sometimes quite easy ways of recognizing, oh, I'll add a few technicians to a project and I'll recognize them, but I won't recognize my greenhouse growers. I won't recognize my plant operators, those folks who are fundamental often to making sure that there's any kind of crops at all. And that may be where we might need to go next, right? As we really start to think about our culture, because that's where I want to take us, is to this culture conversation, the big C, small c, because that culture is not really tiny, as most people want to make it, and only includes a few sets of folks. You've got folks in that culture practicing all around it, some who are peripheral players, some who are right in the midst of it, and that is your culture. That's your norms and patterns and behaviors of interaction, is that culture. And that's where we need to probably start pitching our thinking at that cultural level, and at the systems level. So the view from the platform is all of that. If you were standing on that platform just looking at open research, and based on half the stuff I've just told you, not the stuff I've been criticizing or just challenging us on our thinking, but it's just the cars that keep getting added to more cars, and you don't know which one you go into. There's a lot there. There's a lot. So we need a sort of methodology almost to start to unpick and unpack this. So it's great to hear about the working group that is here based at Surrey and other sets of things like the reproducibility network and others who are starting to ask some fundamental questions. But again, my point is, are we asking the right sets of questions to really start to fundamentally revolutionize and radicalize our thinking in regards to what this culture is and what it can do? And that's really that last point around thinking about those cultures of transformation and change. Because for me, I think, the talent in this room, the brains, the thinking, the energy, the creativity, it's just magnificent. What's in our research and innovation system is also super inspiring and fascinating. And I want that transformative energy to be diffused. And actually be able to create the change all of us would like to see. So how do we do that? How do we enable that in a way that doesn't just have you beating against the same wall or the same door all the time around the same issues? How do we start to do this work slightly differently? And maybe in small little chunks, so we're not overwhelming ourselves, but starting to ask different sets of questions. Okay. Hopefully you're feeling a bit daunted, a little bit, inspired, thinking, yeah, I'm ready. But I want to take you to governance. And it's very interesting taking people to governance. I'm a systems person who does governance, so this is not surprising that I'd be a bit fascinated by governance. And the reason why that I'm going to spend some time with governance and another point in a minute is that it's an area we don't talk about. We talk a lot about the outcomes, the outputs, the people, the types of teams, the various stuff, materials. But I mean, the lexicon surrounding open research is enormous, right? We spend a lot of time dealing with that. We don't really talk about the governance factor. Who decides? What are they deciding? What escalates? What doesn't escalate? How does stuff move? What's private, what's not? What's personal, what's not? What's professional, what's not? What sort of information actually goes into these sorts of archives and databases? Where's the server? That's usually my question, often. Where is that server base, that magic server? Not necessarily the system that they input into, but where is the server? And again, from a security perspective, it's usually the question most people don't ask when they're ultimately thinking about the system, because they're so interested in actually having the system be available. But from a security perspective, you need to know where your servers are based, especially if ultimately, as we are finding in the midst right now, with the invasion in Ukraine, that we have a number of servers based in certain sets of places that make it actually very difficult for people to actually use them because of sanctions or other forms of restriction, much less how those servers are ultimately protected. So again, my two worlds hit together quite nicely with the security threats conversation and this question around open access or open data. But ultimately, it's a fundamental question that we should be asking, which is, where's our infrastructure? Who is governing this infrastructure? How are these things set up? Now, I know I'm fascinated by it. You don't have to be, but somebody needs to be fascinated by what and how are we governing this process? What does that look like? And that's not just, do we have a group that is coming together, and do we have a committee, and do we have committee notes, and does somebody sign off the notes, and then ultimately we store them somewhere, and then we analyze them and understand them. It's literally starting to think about that infrastructure that we're creating around open research, and really starting to think about how is that governed? Is it governed in a way that ultimately we have competing forces who are all lateral, so nobody's actually making a firm decision? Do we all think it's collective? So ultimately, we're all empowered to essentially all make the decisions collectively within this structure, but yet somebody owns something. There's a business transaction somewhere. There's an actual financial agreement with somebody and somebody else around either data or information or storage or something else. So is that really a flat collective power structure? Is there somebody there who is probably not as similarly empowered as somebody else who might own the company that is involved in creating the structure? And again, I'm really fascinated by this because I want to know what happens if it breaks. I want to know what happens ultimately if one of those entities go away. I want to know what happens if somebody buys out somebody else. What occurs? And if we're not sitting there asking these questions, you know, what are we building? And for me, it is managing it, monitoring it, not just input flow out, but ultimately, is it working? Do we want to do something different? How do we understand change within this, especially in creaky processes that might take decades to actually be embedded as normative practice for different sets of disciplines? How do we understand change looking across our social structures? How do you understand risk in this? Where does the risk lie as we're starting to unpack and start to work with this? And then how do we build it? And fundamental for me, how do we make adaptations that don't just become this sort of, I've got a radical new idea through 2 seconds. And then we're trying to set up a new system underneath it when we haven't really figured out the system before that. And now we have competing systems that are now trying to be interoperable, I guess, but nobody really understands how they function. Does it sound familiar? I mean, that is a lot of what we keep doing. And we keep creating often because we're really inspired by something new, which is good, but we need to govern this stuff. We need to really start to carve out some space to start to think about it. So I have a second one that is annoying me. Assurance. And again, these are the unsexy questions that folks typically don't ask around all of this. But I'm really fascinated by assurance. I'm fascinated by the assurance, like the proper risk and assurance side. Do we have any risk and assurance people in the room? Yeah, if you know them, they will be the people you will never talk to unless you do risk and assurance work. Because they're the shadowy structures within your institution that are doing financial auditing or various other things, and they live over there. They're quite fundamental to most of the things that we do around research and innovation because they pop up often to really monitor what's happening within these systems that we give money to, that we invest in, that we do various other things, and they're really fundamental. And around integrity, assurance is massive. So most of you know that quite a lot of integrity processes are appended at the institutional level around the financial assurance aspects. So there are a number of questions, especially around research misconduct, that often get adhered to within that same sort of assurance process, that whether or not it's a year or 2 years in its structure. Because again, if you're a sound governing body that is able to execute and do your work well, you should be ultimately able to get more investment. There's some fundamental logic to all of this. But there's a whole nother set of assurance. And that set of assurance is the way that we have actually created concordats, agreements, manifestos, various sets of things that we want to report. We want to document it. We want to put it somewhere. We want to understand something. We want to fundamentally start to unpick something. And so we've created this kind of system around open research that is fundamentally about giving ourselves assurance about the system. How are we performing? What are we gathering? Who is doing what? What does that work look like? How do we understand whether or not change is happening? So how many people are ultimately putting stuff into an open access system? What is in the repository? Does the repository work well? How are we doing things to sometimes get assurance on our own work? Sometimes we're getting assurance that the work we've said or a policy we've enacted is actually functioning. And sometimes we want to get assurance that actually this is causing the change that we would like to see in the world. So we've got these two competing aspects of assurance. One that is actually in the organizational governance structure of assurance, and another one that is this quasi space of creating material and information. And we examine and we look at that sometimes. We know there's a big challenge around, let's say, research integrity reporting, where we don't really all look at it and actually analyze it and try to figure out what we know and what we don't know. We just do them as narrative reports every year. That's good. That is not a bad thing, but what is that assurance doing? What is that process ultimately doing? What is it giving us confidence of, right? What is it telling us about rigor? Is it telling us about incidences? What are we doing and why are we doing this set of assurance? And I'm very interested in assurance around research culture, because one of the things that I'm noticing, especially around research and innovation culture, is an assurance network and system that is being created often unintentionally, because we want to understand norms and conditions and behaviors. We want to modify and alter some of those. We want to instill certain sets of changes. We want to know if those changes are ultimately working. We want to try to understand and unpack what are these cultures that are out there. So we've created an entire world of assurance. And we don't necessarily call it that. We don't necessarily call it out in terms of ultimately trying to get underneath it. We talk a lot about research culture, and we talk a lot about monitoring and reporting, and I still don't know why. For what purpose? What's the fundamental question that we're asking around these assurance mechanisms? Because otherwise we'll just keep making more stuff. We'll create another system. We'll ask people to monitor and report another thing, and we're not really sure underneath that, what is that giving us confidence of? So these are my 3 questions. It's a challenge to me, and I think it's a challenge to you. How do we know that what we are doing works? Now, I know half of our assurance mechanisms is about that. It's literally trying to get some copy or record of activity or interactions that often is a kind of performance review in reverse, so that we get to see these end results to try to understand, does this policy actually, is it functional? Is it working? How do we obtain confidence in our processes? So the mechanisms that you've put together for various forms of reporting, whether or not it's putting things in repositories or all the way through to thinking about kind of open peer review, doesn't matter. Is this a mechanism to try to understand process? So this is a process point. Could be. It easily could be something that we're trying to understand, does something work in terms of putting it together? So then that means we scrutinize this to understand it on an annual basis, right? Like a performance review. No, not really. When you start to see some of these come up from a process perspective, people don't then do a kind of risk review every quarter to look at the data to then determine what they might change about what they're doing and actually modify it. That's kind of what you would do with that sort of a risk review. After, actually, for a process point, most of the stuff that we do is just an annual report, and it goes somewhere, and it never does anything else on top of that. So there's some amazing transformative potential in the stuff we're doing, in the way we've created our structures and our systems that will, and I know you're jumping onto like, what, we need another repository, we need another thing, we need another stuff, we need to do these other stuff. But it's like, well, actually, we need to try to understand what that stuff is doing and why we're doing it, A, to stand up better things on the back of that, but also because that may be where some of the radical potential might come from if we can get the rationale right around why we're doing some of this work in the first place. And then I'm really interested in who do these assurance processes serve? Is it management? Is it you? Is it the system? Is it all the institutions? Because if every institution is doing this, where's all this information going? And again, remember, I'm looking across the whole R&I system, and I don't have access to all of these things. I just know all these things are happening, and I know people are doing them. So it's very hard to get any read of the whole system by looking, but I know everybody is deeply engaged in making these things. So what are we doing? How are we sharing this intel? How are we sharing this set of knowledge? And how are we stopping stuff that doesn't work? Like stopping it and going, this is not effective. Or do we just pretend and keep doing it and just move on to the next thing? I mean, we do a lot of that. We're very good as a sector of just adding more stuff, right? On top of things. All right, so 3 things to leave you with. And for me, these are some of the fundamentals of the future, because I think this is part of thinking about that radicalization, thinking about sustainable, radicalized, revolutionized thinking, asking ourselves those critical questions. Are we asking them? And then again, going back to that point I was raising before about plant operators and greenhouse growers and cleaners, is how radical is our thinking around our cultures that actually work around R&I? How big is that consideration in terms of what we're doing? So, do we need to build systems and networks within and between institutions and organizations? I think you probably think, yeah, right? That seems like a given. All right, well, what does that look like? Again, top down. So it changes within terms and conditions, or it changes within, it's a contractual expectation. So suddenly now, somebody puts it somewhere, somebody else has to do it, and then it's legally binding. And if you fail to do that, your money's removed. Do you get penalized? No, you can do those sorts of practices. Those sorts of practices work completely fine. But when you start asking about like change behavior, if I decided that the change behavior that I wanted to see was to penalize all of you for not wearing your name tag and not allowing you to sit down, with that, some of you, it makes you put the name tag on, but there's a whole set of you who would probably be motivated to not even wear the name tag, to actually rip it up into tiny little pieces and stomp on it, because you don't want to be forced to essentially wear the name tag to sit in the chair. And you're not even sure what the connection might be between the two. So you'd have to start to think about how you structure this then. How do you build these sets of, is it free will? Is it something that people just want to be galvanized to exchange and engage? That all works great in moments of excess and lots of opportunity and let's say just finances, right? If you get finance squeezed, if your OpEx is squeezed, if your workload is squeezed, doing this first thing is very, very difficult. I don't know where the magic time is going to come from. I don't know where the magic recognition of the time that you don't have is going to come from. And worse, in many institutions, and likely here at the university, that job will fall to one person, maybe 2, maybe a team, maybe a whole team, but they will be trying to carry the entire institution's interactions with another institution on top of the other existing work that we do. That sound familiar for some of you in terms of holding some of that area around open research in terms of what you're doing. So that's a fundamental job. How are we understanding that? How are we really creating both the resource and the space to be able to do that and to do it well, as opposed to giving updates at a meeting to each other, passing a summary note, because we really are actually trying to get underneath this from this radical systems perspective. Okay, creating processes, guidance, advice, and information that enables continuous adaptation and creativity. and then I couldn't resist. Research isn't static and our processes shouldn't be. So forgive me if you've heard me give this bit of a talk before, but I often equate policies with squirrels. And there's a reason for this. So I have squirrels that are around my property. They're quite lovely little things. And we have a number of walnut trees and various other nut trees that are around. And they're very busy picking up the nuts and burying them in lots of places, which you will find later when you're like, oh, look, I'm sure that nut was put there by a squirrel. Now, if you kind of keep going with the metaphor with me, you go, a little bit of time goes by, a tree grows. And that tree grows up and you encounter it and you interact with it. And you may not know Squirrel Johnny or Sally or Imran who essentially put that nut down. In fact, no one knows. And you're just hitting this forest of all of these trees. That is policy. It is. Because you will have policies all around, probably at this point, 1,000 different open research policies. No one knows who created them. No one knows who owns them. No one knows why they're there. And if you try to find the owner, people will look at you funny. And then you'll sit down a rabbit hole of committee records trying to figure out who made the decision to ultimately even do this thing. And then you can't kill it, because it's sacrosanct by this point, because everyone's invested so much energy in essentially keeping these trees in existence that you just can't make them go away. That is not true. You can cut down these trees, the fantasy trees, not the real trees. We like our real trees. But these sorts of policy perspectives, it's like you can do that. You can ultimately decide, are these functional? Do they help us? Do we need to do different sets of things, as opposed to, I have to keep standing up all this stuff all the time because that's just the way it's always been. And you just keep at it, as opposed to asking, do we even want to have any of these around us? And so again, don't be the squirrel. Don't sit and tuck and create things and then leave in your job and go away and then no one knows why these policies are there. Don't be the person just knocking against all these trees and not asking why these trees are there and ultimately trying to do things differently. And then don't be afraid of ultimately thinking, why don't we create a sustainable, inclusive, brilliant system around us that enables us to be able to do our work, as opposed to being essentially, serving the trees, right? We're serving these policies in ways that are not having the policies serve us. And that's where for me, research isn't static. Our policies shouldn't be. They need to be adaptive. They need to be creative. They need to be innovative. They need to be able to give people the energy and the enthusiasm to actually do this work in the first place. So why aren't we just being, really, really, really clear about what do we need and why do we need it? And so if there's anything that you leave with the squirrel story and the ability to go and tackle your policies, especially the ones that are ghost policies that nobody knows why they're there. And then that last one, systems level change and support, right? Moving beyond this moment to a more inclusive future. How do we do that systems level change? And I've been talking a little bit over the talk about the really brilliant work that is happening, the fantastic ideas that people are engaged in, the new policies that are coming online, the policies that are being enacted. And I'm creating them. My teams are creating them. I'm emboldened by this amazing set of creativity that we have. But I'm also thinking a lot about the systems level here. How do we move quite a lot of these sets of discussions and conversations outside of particular domains and silos and areas to really start to move them into actually at that systems level? Now, again, you don't have to try to do all the systems thinking. You can definitely work in your node, in your space, but also keep your eyes out about where is that other corner? Where is the person who mirrors what you're doing? How do you then enable and support people like Emily and others to essentially be able to reach out into other institutions and organizations and continue to raise up and raise out and kind of flatten this set of information flow that we've got? Because for me, I don't really see us being able to crack this unless we're actually able to crack it at the systems level. It will not help us to help individual disciplines or individual sets of researchers or individual sets of institutions if we're not actually being able to think wider across the systems level. And our work is international. So we're not really going to be able to do this if we just focus on the UK and start to think about what does that look like in the UK dynamic, mainly because most of our research and innovators are mobile. They're folks that move back and forth between multiple institutions, and they do it all the time. And we want to encourage that set of work, much less the collaborations that we have. So think at that systems level. Give yourself the privilege and the space to be a systems thinker. So you can start to think, how does this work contribute? What is the wholeness of what we're building? And ultimately, how does that feed into these other sets of dynamics? And hopefully you can get some inspiration from the policy portfolio that I described to you that I carry, so that you can see that there's a lot of read across a lot of these various different areas, even if you come at this from open access, or even if you come at this from this question of open data, or you come at this from a research methods perspective. There is a big, rich, beautiful landscape with which to play with. But I really do want us to radicalize our thinking, radicalize our building, but also create a sustainable space so that you're not tired by the end of the day of trying to do this work. Instead, you're inspired. And on that note, I'm going to thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Karen, for a really inspiring talk. We've got time for a couple of questions. We'll start in the real room. I will just get a microphone, if that's all right. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Oh, right at the back.
Thank you very, very much. That was wonderful. And I think all of us would join to say thank you for acknowledging, because, you know, the teams that support so much of what we do are often very unsung, you know, heroes. Yeah. My question would be, and given your own successes and experience at research, the REF, where it's moved to include impact, which I think many of us are so pleased to see, where do you think that will go, that it will become more and more critical to judging research? And is that a good thing in your view, or not so good?
Well, I kind of represent the group that does the REF. Let me work on my response. Very good question. I mean, most of you know there's a REF review essentially happening. So fundamental questions that I think that the teams leading on the REF are quite interested in. But I think the sector is really thinking a lot about, you know, what makes an impact case study? You know, what's the culture of transformation and change and knowledge production and exchange that we want to support and galvanize in really intriguing ways. I mean, I'll tell you personally, you know, I have found it really quite interesting that, again, this is one of the reasons I was talking about strategies before, is that, you know, I'm all for the revolutionizing the outputs and the thinking and the question of impact. But there are lots of people who are doing volunteering, or they're engaged in community development work, or they do various different things that are kind of sometimes related to their research quite specifically, but often it is part of the universe. It's part of how they methodologically make sense of the world. And in some ways, like for me, it's part of the reason why I was a researcher. So I could tell a story that could move from community development, international relations, engaging with governments, ultimately working on particular products or assets or material, and also teaching and mentoring students and mentoring others. I could tell that story quite nicely. There's a problem if you create an impact structure that wants you to say, what's that one piece of material that you've written that's connected to what you do, right? What's that one piece of thing? Whereas actually I was motivated to be a researcher, and still am, mainly because I wanted to transform the world I live in and the world that my kids and my grandchildren live in. And I wanted to be inspired by the people whose shoulders I stood on. and use the bit of privilege that I have essentially to be of service. REF doesn't know what to do with that. Right? Like it would know what to do with that as an impact case study, that I would recognize the fact that I'm a very limited number of Black female researchers leading large scale research projects. And that is a motivation for every single bit of research that I would do, to motivate me to really transform and understand that, but also want to transform that, right? And that's where I think there is some thinking going about really understanding what is the whole researcher and innovator that people bring to the table when they do their work. Not that individual piece of work, but that wideness. And that is impactful. That is really transformative to some folks. It's really galvanizing them. It's giving them the reason for why they do the work and the way that they do it, and why they engage with young people, or why they work with particular sets of communities. And we're seeing it. The Civic University agenda is a part of that. So anyone who is connected to that here at Surrey, you'll know that that motivation about why and the purpose of universities, that is an impact story, right? It is a significant one. And that's where we're starting to, I think, start to move as a sector. We're really starting to think about these roles and responsibilities we have, no matter what our privilege and positions might be, and also what we might do at those institutional and systems level. Whether or not that ends up in REF, there are REF people running that, and they will hopefully listen to and exchange and engage with the communities in terms of moving forward. But on impact more broadly, I am definitely seeing that as a motivation. You can see it now if you look at statements that people might write if they're applying for jobs. That there's power in those statements as people are talking about why they do their work in the first place. You're welcome.
Thank you. Are there any questions online before I move to anyone else in the room? If you have a question online, you're welcome to just unmute and ask. You have 3 more seconds. Okay, we'll take one more in the room, but remember as well, we have a whole panel discussion later, which Karen will be part of. So if your question doesn't get answered now, then maybe later on.
Hiya, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed hearing a systems level talk, if you will. And one thing that I wanted to ask is there one radical policy that you've been involved in that you're particularly fond of? What is a concrete example of a radical policy, I guess?
One. Really proud of. Let me just, I'll have to think about this. It's a good question. I mean, I guess, let me not answer it first. I think part of it for me is more, what do I take to policymaking that allows me to continue to find a way forward? That's how I try to approach it, as opposed to, how do I create the shiny, brilliant one thing and then I turn to it? It's more, maybe I need to secrete little bits of all sorts of disruptive things in every single policy to be able to have the effect that I might have with the one big shiny thing, right? And that's the golden thread for me, is sort of what's the radical potential that is across all of them, and then what do we do? Because sometimes the policy is outside of my control. You know, I'd love to give you, me, all sorts of levers. I don't have them legally. I can't actually do those. But what I could do is enable the process. So the process of the policy creation, I might be able to really deeply influence that. Maybe it's what we do in the implementation phase that actually is the most critical. So it's not actually trying to create the policy. It's actually, how do you make this thing work, right? How do you fundamentally inspire people to just live with what is often the tension points when you're trying to create new policies or get them implemented, and you need to figure that out and to sort of keep people engaged enough. And I can turn to a number of different things that have, I think, have motivated me, as opposed to feeling that I'm proud of them. I mean, we've been talking about it, but you know, the open access policy for me, for UKRI, is a brilliant example of something built on years of sweat and tears and pain for a whole bunch of people in the sector, who've really wanted to go this direction, and then trying to find a how to that as opposed to a radical change. It's a how to that is quite critical. And so that's a credit to the teams who've been brilliant, working dynamically with the entire sector to think about a way forward. And I am also thinking quite a lot about where we go next around open data, because the teams are definitely thinking about that as we think of digital infrastructure and various other things kind of moving forward. I don't know. I'm going to ponder this, but I think again, it's how to do it lots of different ways, and doing it so that you don't become so disruptive that no one wants to ever talk to you, because that's usually not as good from a policy perspective.
Great. Thank you very much once again, Karen. So if we can just give Karen one more round of applause. Thank you. You know, now we were really pleased to have so many poster applications. So there will be 30 open research posters outside now. So if you're presenting a poster, then hopefully you'll get lots of feedback, lots of networking opportunities. Everyone who's not presenting a poster, please remember that you can go around, have a look at the posters, talk to people, give feedback, and most importantly, please vote for the most inspiring poster. I ask that if you're presenting a poster, you can vote, but please don't vote for yourself. So please go and enjoy the poster session, enjoy the networking. There should be coffee at about 4 o'clock. And the poster voting closes at 4 so that I can count the votes ready to announce the winner. But thank you once again, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you.